The right glove that I wore on my right hand signified the power within Black America. The left glove my teammate John Carlos wore in his left hand also signified Black unity. The scarf that was worn around my neck signified blackness. John Carlos and me wore socks, black socks without shoes, to also signify our poverty.
One must remember, sports and politics have always mixed. Recall the 1968 Mexico City Games. Tommy Smith, seen here, protested on the medal stand with fellow Team USA runner John Carlos. The very things many other athletes have brought to light for generations.
I decided that I wanted to make a statement. I'm here at the games, but I can't just merely go and win a medal and get on the victory stand and just be there like everything is just peachy cream. So I decided that I would approach Mr. Smith. We collaborated. We agreed, yes, we will make a statement. And then we brought artifacts together: the gloves, the socks, the scarf, the beads, the Olympic Project for Human Rights button. And we approached the victory stand. Mind you now, we have been receiving threats throughout that 2-year period leading up to the games. But my thoughts were, well, they might take my life, but they can never take this demonstration away. Once it's done, it's done. I felt that was far more important than my life, because when I came into the games, I didn't go to the games to make a statement for John Carlos. I meant to make that statement for my kids and their peers, for your kids, for a lot of you youngsters that's out in the audience today. That statement still registers 51 years later. So it was necessary to make a universal statement for people to open their minds and begin to challenge themselves in terms of what type of individual, what type of human being I am. Because I can't change it by merely putting my fist to the sky. We as a society have to change the ills of society.
Carlos, speaking decades later, talked of his protest and experience, including the vitriol he suffered at the hands of the media, especially a prominent member who was on the rise in 1968, Brent Musburger. He'd write in his column, Smith and Carlos, quote, looked like a couple of black-skinned stormtroopers, ripping the pair for their stances, labeling it juvenile, ignoble, and unimaginative. He's yet to apologize to this day. While this protest was undoubtedly the stuff of legends, at those very games there was another protest.
It was a night that traumatized Mexico. Exactly 50 years ago, mainly student protesters gathered in Tlatelolco Square to challenge an authoritarian regime. Then, the unthinkable.
Let's take a step back.
But opposition to the war was growing. Voices of those objecting to U.S. involvement in Vietnam were getting louder. In May of 1970, 4 students were killed by National Guard troops during a campus protest at Kent State University in Ohio.
The 1960s were a time of mass protests, not just in the United States. Prague Spring would take place, with Czech students taking on Soviet tanks.
May 68, a month of demonstration, a violent clash between the youth and French authorities that led to early elections. It was also a month of general strike in a country on standstill, left with no oil for its cars and no public transport. May 68 is a unique moment in French modern history.
In France, mass protests. In Argentina, major protests were staged against the military dictatorship of Juan Carlos Onganía. Protesters flocked to the streets, having their peaceful marches met with the power of the state and a violent police force. To reiterate, a time of mass protest. Back in Mexico, the country was preparing to become the first Latin American country to host the Olympic Games. Thus, via Jacobin, the holding of the 19th Olympiad sought to provide a display of political and social stability, a Mexican miracle. Our story begins at a football game. After the final whistle, a fight broke out among fans. The fight itself has been described as no particular big deal. The government's response, though, felt like overkill, wrote Bleacher Report's Robert Andrew Powell. Riot police barricaded students inside UNAM's high school, holding them captive for days. That's when Secretary of the Interior, Luis Echeverria, felt the police response was lacking. Thus, the army was sent in, who sent a bazooka blast that not only destroyed an 18th century door, but some students would be unalived. The students were enraged. Those who fought one another at the game joined forces and pushed back against riot police. They would be joined by teachers, some of whom were political prisoners. Javier Barros Sierra, the president of UNAM, would call for immediate action, leading protests for those jailed. The president at the time, Gustavo Diaz Ordaz, he'd take no action, and when reforms were not met by students, they chanted his name in disrespect. Their demands were rather simple. Repeal of Articles 145 and 146, which basically meant people meeting in groups of 3 or more faced imprisonment, abolition of police, free the students being held, fire the chief of police, and ID the officials responsible for the deaths of classmates. With the Olympics upcoming, Diaz Ordaz grew angrier and angrier, eventually sending in troops to occupy the campus. They'd beat up students and arrest many in the process. In return, the students would march to the Zoccola, viewed as the heart of Mexico City, a landmark with a rich history that would sadly see more of it. With shows, festivals, and music, the government unleashed a slander campaign, falsely accusing the youth of being communist and backed by China, Cuba, and the USSR. Ordaz would feel the movement gaining steam as healthcare workers, the less fortunate, oil workers, telephone workers, and many more would join in. Thus, he called for tanks to evacuate the square. In his State of the Union address, he gave a line that has been uttered by Donald Trump and Richard Nixon: "We must have law and order." It became common for students to see tanks and a heavy police presence in public. Schools were systematically attacked and fired on by government provocateurs from the secret police. The students would then flock to Tlatelolco, hearing speakers rebut the president of the country. Like all governments do, they sent in spies to gather intel and serve as provocateurs within the student movement. They would identify each other with white gloves. On October the 2nd, the Square of Three Cultures, seeing some 10,000 students use their voice for protest, it would become a one-sided battlefield. John Rada, a sports reporter in town for the Olympics, would write of what he witnessed. In summary, he'd report, after about 30 to 45 minutes of hearing speakers, a helicopter dropped green lights that shot up a church. At that moment, I turned to move instinctively to the stairs, and suddenly there appeared 3, 4, 5, or 6 men with revolvers, with more following, indicating to us to get on the floor. My first thought was, this is it. He described machine guns and rifles firing bullets, pinging the walls, and multiple students being hit, one gushing from the temple. Snipers were perched on rooftops. The soldiers at the edge of the plaza began to shoot into it. The story would be spun by those in power. Communist forces fired on the army, and thus the soldiers just had to fire back to defend themselves, they would claim. Over 1,000 people were arrested. Students were beaten and stripped. False confessions were signed. Many were imprisoned. Hundreds were killed, though the government's initial count was low double digits. It was clear from official tallies at the time to state-controlled news a cover-up was taking place. Eyewitnesses even recounted the gory day, watching with their own eyes military trucks hauling away the bodies. It was concluded, after President Vicente Fox came to power and ordered a special prosecutor to investigate the matter, that the snipers fired at troops, which fired back theory was completely inaccurate. Students, teachers, rail workers, you name it, healthcare workers, dead or imprisoned. And it was all For what? Well, for the Olympics to go on. Hey, I appreciate you watching. Now, if you can, please do become a channel member by going to youtube.com/tytsports and clicking the join button. If that's too much for you, you can just go to tyt.com/join to become a member. It helps all of us out here at the Young Turks and keeps our network afloat. In addition, you could follow me on my socials on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Appreciate the love. Have a great day.